Katoa. Welcome to this week's bioethics seminar. So I'm Mike King, head of department, and this week's talk is Philipp, who's going to be talking about animal minds. I'll get to that more in a moment. So a little bit about the seminar series. This runs each Monday from 1 to 2 New Zealand time and features local, national, and international speakers addressing a wide variety of topics. You're welcome to join us in person here at 71 Frederick Street at the Bioethics Centre in Dunedin, or you can join us online at the link that is provided in the emails that you get. If you would like to get an email about these seminars regularly, then please email bioethics@otago.ac.nz and we'll put you on our list. Now, for those of you joining over Zoom, please remember to mute yourselves. I think you've all managed to do that. This seminar will go for an hour, which is the normal way of operating, which is 1 to 2 p.m. We're slightly late due to technical problems, sorry. And the talk will be roughly sort of 25, 30 minutes and then some discussion. Does that work?
Wonderful.
Great, there we go. In the question time, if you're happy sort of fielding questions, that's great. And if you're online, please use the chat or raise hand function during the Q&A period, and then we will ask you to give your question. And if you're in the room, just raise your hand. That would be great. If you have a point to make that follows on from a previous person's thing that they're talking about, is just a short thing, raise a finger instead of a hand, right? If you've just got a quick thing to follow on from that, raise a finger, and then that will help us follow a little chain of discussion, which might be useful. We'll see how that goes. But if it's a normal question, just raise your hand. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Philipp, who is a senior lecturer at University of Canterbury, used to be at my old university at Massey, and before that was University of Queensland, where you did social neuropsychology. Is that right?
Yes.
And before that, you're at University of Maryland.
Yeah.
Look, I know.
Yeah.
And over that time, you've developed a focus on animal minds and animal psychology. So Michael's going to be speaking to us about the moral consequences of people's perception of animal minds, which is particularly relevant for us here in New Zealand with all of our pest control work that's going on, and also all sorts of other ways that we relate to animals as well, I'm sure. So without any more from me, over to you. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much, Mike, for inviting me down, and it's really nice to be able to speak to people both in person in this new hybrid world where we figured out how to bring people from afar in too. So this is great. So I am at the University of Canterbury now. I'm still trying to create this identity for myself, and this is and it's been great being on this South Island now, being able to so easily kind of come down and visit you all. And I've been keen increasingly to kind of find these different pockets of people in the country to have these conversations with, and so it's really looking forward to kind of getting the bioethics kind of perspective on this. I'm going to try to kind of condense things, and I'll skip around a little bit, but try to hit some highlights and then see where conversations lead us across a variety of things. As Mike said, my background is actually kind of social, kind of looking at social phenomena. I'm particularly interested in social psychology, social neuroscience, those underpinnings of social behaviors, and increasingly interested in sort of how we kind of come to understand folk understandings of other entities' kind of minds and the consequences of perceiving those minds. And so, by way of example, so in early 2014, some of you might have heard of Maurice at the Copenhagen Zoo. Maurice was a young and healthy giraffe that was euthanized, culled to just help conserve the wider population of giraffes in captivity, both concerned about captivity at the zoo and kind of widely throughout the world, which is a very weird thing, euthanizing healthy animals for this reason. The zoo explained it as a last resort. Other options were not available or too expensive, and Maurice was killed to minimize suffering, killed in a way that minimized suffering, and then dissected in a public kind of demonstration, a class public demonstration, where people could come along and view it being dissected, and it was fed to lions at the zoo as well. Thanks to the Copenhagen Zoo's radical transparency, this practice was sort of lifted to to the public's kind of discourse, and got to kind of hear about both professionals' responses to this, but also everyday people's. These reactions were varied. People talked about it being counter to global programs in humane education and compassionate conservation. On the other hand, and people talked about giraffes as being really beloved. And so they were criticized for having done this so publicly because giraffes are beloved. Not we don't do it, but we should do it publicly. But others argued really that, alternatives like sterilization would further undermine, the giraffe's autonomy and agency and ability to sort of live a natural life. And that early death may have liberated it from years of imprisonment. Underlying these reactions are very different perspectives on what role Maurice plays in conservation efforts and what considerations are due to Maurice. No doubt the aesthetic appeal of these charismatic megafauna plays a certain role in sort of people's reactions to it, both people from zoo and everyday walks of life. We do tend to perceive more beautiful, long-lived animals as warranting greater consideration. However, the public reaction also referenced Maurice's potential cognitive mental capabilities, talked about its sentience, its entitlement to autonomy as evidence for or against this particular action. So my interest lies in really understanding how these perceptions of the animal's capability, let's put those whatever those actual capabilities are aside, how those perceptions of capability really inform our moral considerations of the animal's treatment. In this case, euthanizing a perfectly healthy animal for conservation reasons. So this leads to sort of the overarching area of mind perception. And I'll be talking about it from the perspective, we'll talk about social cognition research, folk psychology, as this idea that, of course, we have direct access only to one mind, our own, but we readily perceive minds in hosts of entities, both real and imagined. Regardless of what entities possess minds, psychological evidence is clear that there are consequences to perceiving a mind. So for instance, perceiving a mind is really necessary for interacting with an entity in the first place. So before we can have a theory of a mind, before we can even theorize about what something is thinking, we have to have an idea that it's capable of having a mind in the first place. So it's obvious that perceiving a mind is a critical first step to assessing moral obligations to an entity. And so there are varied causes and consequences to mind perception that emerge when considering the affordances of mind perception. So there are causes for the perceiver. So we are arguably motivated to perceive animals' mental capabilities so we can accurately judge the welfare considerations we give or don't give them. So that's talked about a lot with welfare concern, is what is it capable of in the first place? That's something we have to think about. And by being perceived to have a mind, an entity is bestowed with moral status. This in turn creates moral responsibilities in the perceiver. And by perceiving a mind, we then have responsibilities to the entity. These responsibilities demand that consideration. Hopefully the inverse is also obvious. So we do not perceive a mind. We do not perceive a mind. We don't perceive any moral obligations. There's no doubt more recursive models that could be studied and looked at in this. Many avenues for investigation. However, it doesn't make clear that different avenues. So what kind of mind do we perceive when we perceive a mind? So theoretical perspective suggests that minds are not perceived as these unitary constructs. Rather, when asked about capabilities of diverse entities, people regularly perceive a constellation of mental capabilities. Typically, these capabilities can be distilled down to two facets, or what I'll talk about as dimensions of mind. We have these abilities related to subjective states like joy and fear. Generically talk about these right now as sort of these experience capabilities. And abilities related to planning, goal-directed action. I talk about these as agency. So Gray and Wegner's 2007 paper provides probably the most popular demonstration of these two dimensions of mind perception. So they had 2,000 participants rate 13 characters on 18 mental abilities, and they found these two facets emerge. And to be clear, these are very much related to each other, but they talk about them as distinct facets of experience and agency. And so these are sort of where the different entities kind of resided on that matrix. And so we see things towards the top right are those entities that are more capable of both experience and agency, and things lower have less experience for agency, or experience rather, but perhaps more agency. So robots, low experience, but have some agency. God is in the bottom right-hand corner, no experience, but agency. These are people's perceptions. And again, there's some error bars around these, but these are generally where they fell when they did this particular study. This framework, we see that people tend to perceive babies and dogs as highly capable or capable of high experience, but not particular agency and so on. Interestingly, the model conveniently maps onto notions of patiency and agency from moral philosophy. So we can think of these entities higher in experience as being moral patients. They can have moral things done to them. Yeah. And things that sort of are further to the right are moral agents. They're more capable of moral action, doing right or wrong. With this in mind, we start to appreciate perceiving a particular quality of mind informs those moral considerations that we give to it. Research in a variety of disciplines have sort of investigated this over the last decade plus. Social robotics looks at this, and in fact, AI research is a very popular place. This work gets cited. A fantastic example of this is a study by Tanabe et al. They had 186 people just read a vignette, and in the vignette, their robot housekeeper broke down. And the vignette, people are simply randomly assigned to read about either helping this robot and by repairing it, or in a control condition, they just read about putting it in a closet and forgetting about it. People, and again, it's a very simple vignette study, but even in this vignette study, people reading about this, the people who read about helping the robot tended to perceive that robot as more capable, or having higher capacity of experience than when they didn't help the robot. And this was also associated then with just a reluctance to throw it away. And that speaks to us, helping something. Right, when we help something, we are kind of investing in that entity's experience. Human-animal interaction work similarly shown these kind of correlations. So this by Higgs et al. Talked about looking at animal use across various areas, and they looked at this belief in animal mind going across from the right. So further to the right is a higher belief that the animal has some mind. And we see that across all of these areas, this is the acceptability for using in basic research. Animals perceived to have less mind are perceived as more accepting to use them, in basic research and for animal use, for human use, than animals kind of perceived to have more mind. The idea that mind affords moral consideration around eating animals is also nicely demonstrated by some of the work that Brock Bastian's done over the years. This paper in particular, though, across 3 studies, makes the case that mind perception is dynamic, and in fact, changes according to contextual cues and the purposes animals may serve us. But one of their first kind of scatter plots is a nice one, just looking at that relationship between mind and edibility. So how much mind an animal has is related to how edible we perceive it on average. So we see that top right quadrant is completely blank, right? The things that we find highly edible, we don't perceive as having much mind. But they also found this, they have demonstrated this experimentally. So bringing people into a lab in a pre-test, post-test design, they had people come in, rate the mind, I think it was mind attribution of a sheep or a cow. And then they were told they're going to participate in a little food tasting study. And people who were told they were going to participate in a food tasting, a nice charcuterie platter, then before they even tasted it, kind of when they asked to rate the mind perception again, rated them as lower than people who are going to taste a fruit platter. So this kind of gets this idea that we will change these perceptions to sort of help us with our dissonance processes, perhaps. So I'm particularly interested in how perceptions of animal minds inform moral considerations we give them. Also, most studies that treat animal mind perception as a unitary construct, they really ignore that dimensionality. And so these are the two, that dimensionality is of particular interest to me too. And also whether these different dimensions, these different facets of mind might actually differently predict moral consideration we give to animals. And so the very first place I got drawn into this was around this idea of population management euthanasia, supervising a student who was interested in it. She was particularly interested in looking at how zoo workers kind of their attitudes around the use of euthanasia in zoos. A great example of just those attitudes, and probably the only one that I'm aware of that's been looked at, is this paper by Powell and Arduino. And they essentially looked at zoo workers' attitudes towards the acceptability of euthanasia for different species, and find a rather unsurprising pattern, which is it's less acceptable for these charismatic megafauna. But as we get to invertebrates and more pest species, we perceive it as more and more acceptable to euthanize animals for these population management reasons. Well, we all have pet theories about why this relationship exists, and there's other probably factors we could talk about. My aim was particularly to see if people's perceptions, and everyday people, not zoo workers, whether those perceptions of animal minds further informed our attitudes towards population management euthanasia above and beyond sort of other factors. So I'll talk through very briefly the first study. I'll talk about a second study and talk a little bit about the measurement stuff, and then we can just answer questions and see where we go. But so the very first study, we just wanted to see if we could replicate this among everyday folks, and then look at what aspects of mind perception predicted this. So part of me wanted to simply see if we found these different facets of mind, could we replicate sort of this pretty picture, this scatter plot isn't replicated enough, I think. And so we wanted to see if these facets exist where things are plotted. Do we get this similar pattern among everyday folks, and then what relationship is there? Our first study, we gave all participants these different characters. So people got familiar with these different animal characters. This is a similar methodology to what that original Gray and Wegner paper did, where the characters were given names, they had little icons associated with them. And then we had people read about, rate the capabilities of the animals, so, or the different characters. So there were some humans in there, a tree as well. And we had them rate 9 capabilities, so self-control, memory, and so on. These, so with the exception of intelligence, these 8 are generally used quite a bit in the mind perception literature as just sort of the go-to capabilities that are looked at. We included intelligence because I wasn't sure if it a capability, is it something else, does it account for everything? So we included it here just to kind of, as a general kind of controlling for intelligence, do these do anything? As a side note, I'll give a brief preview of some of the psychometric studies that we did as well, kind of looking at how these different capabilities line up with each other, kind of they cluster together. But these 8 bolded capabilities actually, for us, cluster into 3 different facets. So I'm getting way ahead of myself, but I want to talk about this because I'm going to actually talk about these facets instead. So we see that the humor, boredom, pleasure, and memory actually cluster together, and kind of what I would think of as similar to the experience dimension that we see in other research. The agent, self-control, and planning actions seem to cluster together. And we have these other ones, hunger and fear, that come together as well. Intelligence, we didn't plot with these, but I'll just say for a moment that this is one of our concerns around some of the measures of mind perception, is actually in measures of mind perception for kind of wider entities, there's certain things that don't vary that much when you apply it to animals. So for example, hunger and fear actually just don't vary that much. Most non-human animals are perceived as capable of these kind of foundational things. And so this was sort of one of the things that triggered our thinking about this being a really unique thing. Anyway, on that aside, these are the capabilities that people rated. And then for the non-human animals, we asked them to rate the acceptability of using population management euthanasia for that animal. And so in terms of the mind perception space, we found a similar pattern, what we'd expect. We did find these 2 dimensions. I'm leaving the foundational dimension out of it for now. And if we zoom in on so we see the humans in the top right, the baby, high experience, low agency, as Gray and Wegner found. We included a tree just to have some help to find the space, but tree is where we'd imagine it to be. And if we zoom in on the non-human animals, kind of see this general pattern. Again, it's one that I think most of us would think is pretty realistic to what we'd expect. In terms of these acceptability of using population management with euthanasia with different non-humans, again, see a pattern. It's probably terribly surprising. If it is, we can come back and talk about it. But how well do those perceptions of mind predict this? So, so using just a basic linear regression, we found that only the experience dimension is really negatively, was the only thing related to acceptance of population management in euthanasia, and negatively so. So as ratings of experience go up, that acceptance of population management euthanasia go down. Agency isn't related to this. Intelligence isn't related to this. It's just this experience dimension of mind. If you're interested in this numbers, these are the numbers, but I'm going to zip past them for now as we talk through this. So study 1 gave us some evidence of this. Study 2, we did second study just to sort of generalize this, focusing completely on non-human animals. I was interested particularly in conservation species, so we started looking at conservation species, New Zealand and Australia. Did a between subject design, so previously everybody saw all the animals. Now each participant only saw rated one animal. And we came up with a better measure of a more thorough measure of mind perception. So the second study, we had people looking at these different conservation species, again, trying to get a full gamut of the animal kingdom. So we included the giant clam because it's the Indian Ocean. So. And our measure of mind perception can talk for a long time about how we kind of pulled this together, but pulled together from other measures and also in consultation with animal researchers in particular, and kind of thought this would probably capture kind of a good space of mental capabilities without overtaxing people. I think there's adjustments we'll make, but this grabs most of it. We also asked about some other features of animals that we think are probably quite related to kind of the moral consideration we give to them. So the beauty of the animal, the aggression, endangeredness, how long of a life it has, how delicious it is to eat, we know probably plays a role, and again, how intelligent the animal is. And so we again asked about, for each animal, after asking about the mind perception rating for the animal, we asked how acceptable it would be to euthanize the animal for population management reasons. And in study 2, this was so we'll talk first about this perception of animal mind scale. These are how the different components came together. So love, compassion, happiness, friendship, all sort of formed this, seemed to cluster together, right, this experience dimension, what looks like the experience dimension, at least in relation to other studies that look kind of more globally. I also find this agency kind of ability for self-directed action, so self-control, inferring others' thinking, multitasking, planning, and so on. And again, found this really clear third dimension of these really foundational capabilities, more kind of highlight sort of more primitive, just animal capabilities that don't move around much, but they tend to cluster. So being able to tell the difference between large and small things, hunger, having urges, being able to move. So then we created scores based on these 3 dimensions, and then looked at what of these various things were predicted, or that we collected, these predictors, what predicts that acceptability, what correlates with it most strongly in our sample. Among the other impressions, we found that beauty, aggression, and the deliciousness to eat stood out the most as strong predictors of the acceptance of population management euthanasia. So ironically, the more delicious it is to eat, the more we thought it would be okay to kill it for conservation reasons, which is super interesting. Probably hiding some other things there. But consistent with other research, the more aggressive it was perceived to be, the more acceptable it was. And the more beautiful it is, the less acceptable it is. But in multiple regression, all these things are entered in the same model. So we're controlling for all these factors as we also then look at the mind perception things. And so we find that, again, that experience dimension stands out. So controlling for these other dimensions. And this is controlling for intelligence as well as there. We're still seeing experience come out, that animals' capability to have that experience kind of dimension of mind negatively predicts the acceptance of euthanizing the animal. Agency doesn't, but again, that foundational one, that smaller foundational capability stood out as well as a positive predictor, which is interesting. I don't have a lot of thoughts to extrapolate on that. I think there's interesting stuff going on there. But again, we have these 3 dimensions of mind normally get pushed together, and what we're seeing is actually different facets predict different things. So putting it all together probably muddies the water. I have the numbers if you want to look at it, but it's fun. So perceiving the capacity for experience really seems to decrease that acceptance of population management euthanasia. This is above and beyond that capacity, how beautiful we perceive the animal, a lot of these other characteristics we think are going on, and even controlling for intelligence. So it's not just intelligence, there is other stuff going on there. And these facets of mind matter. I want to talk about this, just a little bit about the measurements of animal minds because it's not terribly well done. If we look at the human-animal interaction literature, there's a lot of work that does look at how perception of mind and this kind of idea is associated with different welfare considerations, but it's not terribly well. They're not terribly well, usually not terribly well conceived measures, or they're measured borrowed from, say, human studies. And as we see, actually, these capabilities might be different kind of constellations of capabilities when we're looking at just non-human animals. So in our first study, we had, well, these 6 plus 2 other items. And I talked about how I had in the first study, we kind of thought beforehand, the theoretical groupings would be the hunger, fear, and pleasure would be the experience ones. Agency would be self-control, memory, and planning. And then we'd included humor and boredom because those hadn't been looked at in previous studies, and intelligence. So theoretically, this is the model we thought we were going to test when we did study 1. But when we look at the empirical model, when we kind of pulled it apart with factor analysis, essentially, we see that the clustering is actually very different. And so why is it that in Gray, and Wegner, and so many other studies that say they've kind of looked at these and justified these clusters, why do we see a different kind of clustering happening when we're focusing just on non-human animals? One clue to this goes back to a paper in 1993. So Rasmussen et al. In Journal of Comparative Psychology, this paper, Human Perceptions of Animal Mentality, Descriptions of Thinking. And they did a similar sort of thing. They gave these groups of different capabilities. So sensation, perception, enumeration was in there. Dreaming is in there. I love that one. Conservation, memory and foresight, and so on. And they had people rate a child and then 4 non-human animals. And they found a factor structure. They found that each of these categories actually did cluster with different groups better than others. What was striking about it, though, is that the factor loadings, these constellation of items, were different when we looked at just the child or when we looked at just the non-human animals. So just to walk through the play and imagine factor, for example, clustered together for pets, clustered together with gratitude, emotion, pleasure, and displeasure, these very kind of experience-related things. But when we talk about a child, it tended to correspond to sort of these, what we might think of as higher level, what they talked about as more complex kind of things, these more complex mental capabilities. And so we see kind of across this that play, enumeration, dreaming are qualitatively different things when we're talking about humans than when we're talking about animals. We actually conceive these abilities as more complex things in humans than we do in animals. And so this may be a case to actually think this constellation of capabilities in animals probably it's reasonable to think that we'd see something different if we're just focused on non-human animals. So I'll try to skip ahead a little bit here. Pardon me. So we've gone through a few studies now where we've given people this bigger list of our perception of animal mind scale and tried it out just to see how they cluster together with different species. So in our first study, that big long list, actually I can show it to you here. There we go. So we extracted these different capabilities from another measure by Mal 2019. He's a folk psychologist that does mind perception work, looking at just a variety of entities. We started borrowing some of these items to make up our scale. And then we also kind of extracted from the animal, so from actual comparative psychology work, capabilities that we have a good understanding that animals have. So being able to manage multiple tasks, mere self-recognition, remembering others. And we combined these are sort of where we drew on to develop our scale. And so we've looked at this across a few studies. So we've, again, this is a study where we just, for each one of these animals, we asked people to rate them, and we gave a little write-up about each one. And this isn't meant to be looked at, let's just kind of look at this holistically, but we see a lot of variability across these animals on these different capabilities, depending on the different animal. So the sea lion at the top and the arc clam is the second for the bottom, so that's probably the biggest contrast. And so we do have a sense, though, that most of these vary well. On the other hand, we will see from time to time, if we look at, these will be, so things like moving on its own, which is this top left one. We do see that actually this is one of those that, although maybe works with a variety of real and imagined entities, when we look at animals, it doesn't change much. There's a bit of a ceiling effect there. The arc clam is the only thing that has variability. And so this speaks to sort of, again, this need to kind of think about specific items unique to animals. The real long and the short of it, let's see if I can get to the end here, is that across multiple studies, we see this pretty stable kind of constellation working together. When we ask people on variety of animals, we see these different capabilities all sticking together across varied samples and different target animals. And although I think one of the really neat things is, although these capabilities are quite strongly correlated, so agency and experience are typically correlated about 0.7 with each other, so they're sharing about half of their variance. Even that foundational one is correlated with both of them positively. So all three of these are positively related to each other. We see that they, again, are each uniquely predicting kind of those moral considerations differently, not just for euthanasia, but one of the more popular measures used in the literature is a moral consideration scale. So it's kind of averaged together people's responses to it's wrong to kill the animal, wrong to harm it, treating the animal with compassion, and so on. And if we use that as sort of just a general catch-all for moral consideration you might give an animal, we again see that even controlling for beauty and intelligence, each of these are doing different things. So experience positively predicts. This is positively correlated with that moral consideration. Agency, though, appears to be negatively correlated with this moral consideration scale, and these foundational capabilities are positively correlated with this moral consideration scale too. So it's interesting that these related facets are really uniquely predicting moral consideration, different moral considerations, not just in that specific case of population management euthanasia, but also just in this kind of moral concern scale that we have. And so I'm really keen to kind of look at other facets. I mean, one of the things that came up with the giraffe in particular is people talk about sterilization as being a morally, reprehensible thing to do to animals, and just looking at, how does sterilization, fit with this? And I'd love to see agency actually positively, correlating with some of this at some point too, which you imagine could be the case. So my interests kind of in this area are diverse. I'm playing around quite a bit, which is why I'm trying to expose myself to as many different populations of people as possible who have interests to find out what else is going on. Really interested in getting a good measure developed, and we have that's kind of currently under review, or not under review, being written up. Did some work last year looking at the aesthetic qualities. So if we cartoonify animals, how does that change these perceptions? Cartoons are used a lot in these things. Turns out beauty and cuteness are really different factors and differently predict or differently correlated with these mind perception as well. Something I'm increasingly interested in, how these interactive conservation experiences, whether kind of virtual or real life interactive conservation experiences, these where we go one-on-one with animals, how that affects these perceptions of mind. If it really potentially even undermines, kind of objectifies animals, which might help conservation, but deteriorate sort of, the richness, rich understanding we have of animals. Consequences of helping, looking at how we frame pest species is fantastic as well. And this idea of extended cognition is interesting. This idea of, like, when we talk about ant minds, for example, an ant by itself perhaps has a mind we could talk about, but multiple ants perhaps have a very different mind. And so too in humans, we have a sense of the mind of a collective being differently capable. Is fascinating. But also how, well, I'll stop there. I think that was a lot to that. So really appreciate your time. Apologies for the scattering of all this, but hopefully we have some good conversations. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks very much, Michael. So hands up virtually on Zoom if you have questions. Raise your hand or use the chat function there. Otherwise, hands up in the room.
You could once you stop sharing, then
I should stop sharing.
Yeah,
yeah, perfect. Yep, I should do that. That's
gallery if you like.
Thank you.
So you can make a gallery view. Yeah, there we go.
Excellent. Wonderful. We had to.
Thanks for that. It was super interesting.
Thank you.
I noticed that you're talking in the studies you've done about population management of that same species, so justifying killing a giraffe for the sake of all giraffes. But in the conservation context here, it's killing one species for the benefit of others. So I'm wondering if you've looked at that, because I've New Zealand's done a really good job at really vilifying all these pest species, and I think a lot of it is because like possums are pretty gross and scary and nocturnal, and then you have these beautiful native birds. So I think there's a lot going into that, but I'm wondering if you've done any work or have any theories about how the acceptability might change when we're looking at, you know, killing possums to save kiwi.
Yeah,
For
I
example.
mean, I thought it's never framed as population management. It's framed as that's a
Yeah.
pest, right? And we
Yeah.
kill, you know, and that I think we frame this is it goes to the euphemisms we use, right? It's like pest is just a thing we can kill
Yeah.
because it harms. Well, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
Sometimes we use it. Doesn't matter. Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually so some people at Canterbury who are kind of looking at pest species in particular. We're hoping to put sort of this measure into an upcoming study just to see how that if that's affected what's happening there. That's not the main purpose of it. I think that it's super interesting, but they're not all terribly vilified. So I mean, hedgehogs are a super big problem, right?
Yeah.
Hedgehogs and cats are, I mean, arguably like the hardest ones to make any inroads with. And I find it hard to, I've both killed and saved a hedgehog last year. So I've experienced both ends of the spectrum, and it's going to be a hard one for us to figure out. I do think there's something to it, but I mean, so many of these pests, what's a pest species? I don't know. What are we trying? Again, it's all about us and what we value as sort of framing that thing. And pest species are very contextual. So you can have a lot of native species that are pests if they're in the wrong habitat too. And so we don't maybe call them pests. What are we calling them? Yeah, so I'm very interested in it. Yes, let's see what happens going forward.
All right.
Thanks.
Sorry, I just wanted any other hands up in the room, just so I can track that. Go.
So I had two questions. My second one was this question that was asked here.
Yeah.
I wondered if you looked at possums in New Zealand versus people's New Zealanders' perceptions of possums versus Australians, how different?
100%. No, we were in Brisbane before we moved over here, and I remember my wife coming in with a baby possum that had fallen out of its mother's pouch, and me at 11 o'clock at night walking to the emergency vet service with it because it's an endangered species that you cannot not do that with. And then moving here, and the whiplash is incredible, isn't it? I haven't at all. So this is completely in its infancy. And I'm having, in some ways it's hard because I still have to write these up, and I'm really reluctant to collect more data until I have that. But I think that's a fantastic one because we have a lot of those. And I mean, and even cats, for example, are huge pests. You know, they are pests in other parts of the world. Like they are. You go to India, you go to Southeast Asia.
Well, I think even
cold
New
and-
Zealand, they're pests.
Well, they
So
are.
I would be, using my
Culturally,
I would find it hard. I would say that it would be worse to kill cats than it is to kill possums, even though they probably, sit about
love it.
the same point on the scatter, the scatter plot.
yeah.
My other question was why give them names? So in the first study that you did, you named everything.
Yep.
Is
It was because that Gray and Wagner paper did it, and we were just sort of, I was just like, oh yeah, no, I appreciate it. Anthropomorphizes does a lot of things, but it was just sort of trying to kind of make it relatable. And because also I think because we had all participants were rating all of the characters, it just probably was helping us as a memory cue as well a little bit. I agree that it was not ideal, and that's why we did the second study too. So we found very different things in the second study. I think that could be a big criticism of that, but I think in finding a similar pattern, I don't think I would name them all in the future.
You would have to not name the humans though as well, right? So if the humans.
That's right. I mean, we named,
then you wouldn't want them to have a advantage by virtue of naming.
Well, could you just put a picture?
You could. No, there's a lot of different ways. There's absolutely a lot of different ways of doing it. And it was mostly we're using that original Gray Wagner I was trying to stay as close to them as possible, just as a model for doing a first kind of as my first toe into the area. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, someone on it. Great. Paula, would you like to unmute, and if you could turn your camera on, that would be great too.
Okay.
Or
Sorry, I'm having trouble turning my camera on. It doesn't
No,
seem
no
to
worries.
want to.
Just ask your question, Paula.
Okay. It was just that I was really interested in this thing about the factors that are associated with agency, how the agency thing doesn't seem to
Mm.
correlate with the perception of animal minds. And I was just wondering if you had any ideas why that might be the case.
So to be clear, all three of the factors that are correlated with each other quite strongly. So especially, so the agency and experience, as I said, are correlated, have a positive correlation about 0.7 with each other. So that's a pretty strong correlation. What's interesting though, is that they really uniquely predict different things when it comes to predicting those moral considerations. So the experience really positively correlates with the moral consideration we give to the animals. And it seems, if anything, the agency one negatively correlates, right? So the more agency we perceive, the less correlated. So I think this is the real fascinating thing about this measure, is that it's really, Gregory and Wagner got criticized for saying, oh, well, we have these two facets, but they're really well correlated. So why even have facets? And the answer is, well, because they really seem to correlate separately with very different things. And I think that unique kind of ability of them to do that is the fascinating bit to me, I guess. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, but because I guess the agency versus the experiential, or the experience.
Yep.
They seem to sort of correlate differently. Is that right? Or
They correlate with each other, but they predict different things. They really
yeah. So why do you think that it the agency predicts?
Because that agency, I think, so going back to the beginning, I think that agency, if we think of agency as that indicator of moral patiency, you can have more moral things done to you or not. That's the thing, right? That sort of, the more of a moral patient you are, the more moral consideration you deserved. Whereas agency has to do with your ability to do harmful things, right? So this is correlated with harmfulness, like how potentially harmful an animal is its agency, right? Its ability to do bad things. I haven't even looked at that. I'm talking way past things. Actually, I think that could be a difference going on there. So it really does speak to that dissociation of the two and what they kind of predict. And that experience dimension should be predicting that moral consideration of it as an entity that deserves our consideration.
Okay, yeah, it's just because I'm just doing a PhD at the moment, and it involved interviewing people about their perception of pets. And so it involved, you could definitely see the areas of agency and but so yeah, I was just but that's really all what I asked. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Wondering about changes over time. Oh, was it me?
That's right. You go, and then we'll go to you, Simon. Go.
Do you think there are changes? Because we've learned, I mean, quite a lot of stuff that I think a lot of people intuited has been proven now, like that animals play or that they have friends or, this kind of stuff. This is much more been kind of discussed. Do you see changes? And then similar, like another thing that I think is changing is maybe, well, I wonder if you see a change in like the relationship between the perception of mind in another animal and our willingness to kill it. So I actually think a stoat probably has a very like super high capabilities on everything that you've been mentioning. It's an extremely capable creature.
Yeah.
Probably on all the different dimensions. And so that's not why I think like that has less and less to do with why I might think it's okay to kill it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like less relationship between mind, my perception of their mind, and my willingness to kill.
Yeah, and I think we could all make an argument that there are things, that it's still okay to kill a thing, even though it has this mind. It's just something we have to sort of deal with. I mean, it doesn't, we have to reconcile with it. Hey, if almost certainly it is the case that those perceptions of mind are malleable and will change over time. So, I mean, there have been some attempts at doing this, looking at sort of like students taking animal welfare courses, like vet students taking animal welfare courses, using terrible measures of animal mind, which is what I'd love to do this, I'd love to get a chance to kind of do that again. And just seeing over the course of even the semester, if you kind of start to understand the phenomenological experiences better, what animals are capable of, sensory experiences and cognitive abilities, does that change that schema some, or does it even change that dimensionality some? Potentially it does. It's almost certainly the case that the dimensions are different among different groups of people depending on familiarity. I mean, I think there's comparative psychologists who would acknowledge there's probably this real the more rich kind of nuanced thing going on. I think
people in Dunedin know a lot more about sea lions than people in other parts of this country. Probably have quite potentially evolving intuitions.
Yeah, I think it's there's very recursive model of what's causing what. I think our perceptions of those minds, just from instance to instance, we saw in that experiment of just that meat eating study, can change quite quickly to help me cope with eating a delicious bacon, in the morning, not worrying about how I've met lots of pigs that are incredibly intelligent. That's the one that's going to haunt me. So I think, absolutely. And I think that's why we need good measures, or at least start thinking about the measures that we're using for it, because currently the measures used for mind, kind of indexing our perceptions of minds and what animals are capable of are really horrible. Not that this is perfect, but I think at least gets to that, starts to try to give them.
Do you think it should matter? Do you?
Sorry?
Do you think it should matter?
That
how much mind I perceive something to have versus how my willingness to kill? Do you think they should be connected?
I think it on average seems to inform everyday people's judgments. I don't know that it should be the overarching thing, but definitely if you read about that Copenhagen Zoo example, the thought process they went through was incredibly nuanced and really tried to disregard emotional factors and really tried to look at the whole landscape, and they were criticized for it and praised for it at the same time. It's fascinating to kind of look at that. I think the biggest thing is they said out loud what everyone never wanted to say out loud, conservation wise, right? But it's I think I think for us, anytime we're doing anything we're talking about conservation of animals or anything animal related, it's appreciating that is a factor that is playing into most people's perceptions. Right? I think we can override it. We can definitely say, I think is the human euthanasia, right? Debate, question. We override a lot of these things because we realize actually it's up to the person. Ironically, we use the same word for animals and they get no choice, right? So that's fascinating too. So I don't know that it has to be, no, but I think it does. And it seems to, at least in the data we have. Is that, yeah.
Simon. Yeah, I think I was going to ask about that, to actually how one moves from the findings to a normative conclusion. And I think what you're saying is that you are trying to be neutral on that as a scientist.
And this is, I hate being neutral on it, which is why I want to find applied people to do it with, because I think there's a real, I don't know the right tack to take with it. Yeah, I'm open to that.
Could you characterize your position on that?
I think I characterized it with Mike at lunch, where I was like, I appreciate in 100 years time, what we're doing, my eating habits will be like incredibly canceled. Yeah.
Because of the mind, what we know about the mind.
Oh, just because we all have a very good idea that all the animals, well, most of the animals we eat are way more sentient.
So it is.
I mean, we're doing, genocide gets used a lot right now, but I feel like in 100 years time, like that's,
Okay, well, I had one small thing then, which was it would be interesting to do a similar work, and maybe people have done it about. So I mean, I think the standard thing is it's quite intuitive for people that capability for mental states is moral status conferring, right? And so if something has less capabilities, its moral status would likely to be less, other things equal. So that's why people want to, well, arguably that suggests why people want to evaluate things less on their mental capabilities, because they want there to be less of a moral reason for them not to use it in harmful ways. And stuff. I was wondering if there's similar work. So if that is the picture, I was wondering if there's similar work done for people who need to harm people, or do other things that they feel some moral resistance to. And you mentioned sort of end of life choices. it would be interesting to know whether people who are in a position to be facilitated aid in dying might have different and possibly self-protective beliefs about the mental states that those people are capable of, or what their capacities are, and so on. And then you kind of want, through all of this, some objective measure of what their actual things are, rather than people's just.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, perhaps. I think in the case of a person making the decision for themselves, it really like prioritizes that agency, right? I mean, I think to the extent that you that hire that agency, then I get to make a choice for myself, and really empowering that side of it, which I don't yet. That's super hard. But again, as you say, the law says we have to have a third, another person there to sort of mediate it and
There is some
do it,
research, I
right?
think, in genocide
Yeah.
on how
Yeah.
how you characterize the others
Yeah.
that you are going to kill, and it's definitely.
And in social psychology, this is used a lot.
Yeah.
Out groups are
Yeah.
just have
Yeah.
impoverished minds compared to in-group members. I mean, that's just a very with these similar measures, for sure. Yeah, I mean, human euthanasia stuff, in fact, is where I'd love to eventually go. But boy, that's a super sticky, fun,
Absolutely.
interesting one.
Yeah.
Because it's yeah. So sorry, what was?
No,
That was- I think we did-
sort of. I was just wondering. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Just wondering, do you think it could work against, because against maybe the equality or welfare, whatever beings that you are interested in by first measuring perception, which is completely subjective of our species. And then even if we came up with objective measures, whatever neuroimaging we will come up with, but it will be our criteria. So it'll be completely up to us what we want to see and what we want to say that is worth almost providing with this set of statistics. It's just fancy way of justifying it. Why do you think we will ever have ground to say that why do we have to measure other beings and give them things, give them status accordingly? The farm animals not even considered, because it's the giraffe, we even think about these questions, but what about all those?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to, in some ways, it has to get considered, and that's a sort of like welfare. I mean, welfare considerations, like the NPI, right? I mean, has the animal welfare group, and they're very concerned about the promotion of animal welfare, and the promotion of animal welfare has carry on sort of financial consequences, right? And so by treating an animal better, it costs us money to treat animals better in this country than not, right? And so in some ways, it's actually just getting a sense of what everybody else thinks, because it's the social license. I guess it's that idea of social license that's probably the most important, isn't it? Is actually for any animal use, all animal use requires everyone else to be on board. And for everyone else to be on board, we all sort of, this is going to be part of that, is like, what's the animal capable of?
It feels like it will help more towards helping them keeping the practice rather than
doing the other thing.
Yeah.
But I think the other side is, if we could make people quite aware of these capabilities, right? And we could promote better, the idea that actually, stoats have incredibly rich mental life and social structures, and by culling them, we are, we might as well call human beings from the earth then, right? And I think that's interesting too. So I'd say, though, there are other criteria we could use. So we could just kind of look at the innate quality, all life as being kind of having this innate kind of quality to it that's deserving regardless. That's another, I think, moral philosophy we could, apply to it. But it seems to be the folk kind of understanding of these things in our samples, at least, kind of dictate that, these considerations do play a role.
For example, quickly, just in Buddhism, for example, they say no sentient beings. So their bar is sentience, no sentience, right?
Sure.
For example, and then
But who decides?
No, exactly. But then it's pragmatically, nobody can survive in a way without harming anybody else to a different degree. And then we will measure what we can avoid, what we cannot, rather than this deserve to be saved, this not deserving to be killed. This seems feels a bit off. I don't know.
Yep, and it's thanks to our paternalism that we make those decisions, because we've taken it ourselves to make the decisions for the animals. Yeah, no, it's up. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much. Great, so thank you. Our next seminar will be not next week. Next week we have a break for 1 week. Then we're resuming the following week on the Wednesday, not on the Monday. And on the Wednesday, that will be a joint bioethics philosophy talk, and it will be on the philosophy of medicine. Details to come about the location, but it will be somewhere over on the main campus with from philosophy.
And it unfortunately won't be on Zoom, I understand.
And it
but
won't
we'll
be on
confirm
Zoom
that.
following the kaupapa of
Philosophy.
philosophy. So thank you very much again, Mike.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Michael, you.